Good afternoon. Welcome to the panel that's now discussing the intersections between literature, medicine, and psychoanalysis. This to say is we're like trying to find the somatic ground of thought. And this saying, I present you a well-balanced panel, but we are still an endangered species because we're sitting under the Bösendorfer. And as I have learned, the Bösendorfer has to come down at 2:15, so that's our time frame, and this whole building is, of course, a trust in static, so don't be afraid. The whole series we did about Vienna pre-1900 was based on the idea that you walk into a Richard Wagner opera, have read something, walk out, and you land on the couch of psychoanalysis. So feel comfortable. Imagine every chair is a couch, and we are going to present you a real tour de force through the history that leads to psychoanalysis, but also dealing with the foreseeing qualities of literature. And I bring to your mind that the famous French novelist Stendhal, when he was in Italy, he discovered people wishing to stand in front of the big Giotto frescoes, and he discovered the nervous reactions on it because people tended to fall down due to their pre-excitement. So the Stendhal syndrome, as it was later called, is one of those first pre-psychoanalytical or pre-1900 phenomenons. And before we start and I present the panel to you, a short present now for Helga. As the Salzburg Festival was so under pressure in the first panel, we are part of a generation. We're part of a generation seeing clearly until the beginning of madness. Hugo von Hofmannsthal, in one of his first texts in the Frankfurter Zeitung on his beloved Gabriele D'Annunzio. We are discussing about the route to psychoanalysis, using literature as a means of transport, but of course also the tradition of medicine and also the interplay of international medicine and the history of medicine in especially Vienna with the Zweite Wiener Medizinische Schule. I want to introduce the panel. I start from the left to the right. I start with Daniela Finzi. She's research director at the Sigmund Freud Museum. She's, like me, a literary scholar, and she did an important book and program, Culture of Differences, Transformation in Central Europe. So she is really the larger view on the whole topic, not only coming from the literary department. Sitting beside her, Elise George. She is assistant professor of German studies at Stanford University, and she's currently fellow in Vienna at the IFK, which is an important institution also for us of our generation, with this institute trying to fund and financing our pre-research, normally once again in a PhD, or important fellows coming from the US also to Vienna to do research here. She has written a remarkable book, The Naked Truth, Viennese Modernism and the Body. I strongly recommend this book because it's a different approach to the Vienna 1900 topic. The other man with me on the panel, George McCary, he is a historian, he is psychoanalyst, he's psychiatrist, he's professor of psychiatry, and he's written some very, very important books. I bring to mind the best-selling author, Soul Machine, The Invention of the Modern Mind. Out of this book, he will do a presentation of the history of ideas leading to the strength of psychoanalysis, and I'll be your PowerPoint boy for the presentation. I think we have just the 19 slides, so we'll go through this. And I want to remind that he's published a new book, Strangers, History of Xenophobia, which has already been awarded and has been published in 2022. Sitting close to my side, Katharina Prager. She's coming from the Wien Bibliothek. She is head of the Department of Research and Participation at the Vienna Library in the City Hall. She's currently, she has a new exhibition on Karl Kraus that she has led, and she researches, publishes in Vienna, and I also want to mention that Katharina is heading the important project of Vienna VICCA, which is a big, how to say, a lexicon on...
it's like Wikipedia, but on a
local...
It's
like Wikipedia, it's the Wikipedia on Vienna, let's call it like that. And it's important because for us as journalists, it's a real important research phase, and it's very valuable what you do with this field of research. So thank you all for being here. I would suggest, George, that we start with your history of thought discourse, and I'll try to bring the slides to the audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here. So a bunch of years ago, I spent a decade writing a book before Soul Machine, actually, which is I'm going to talk about today, called Revolution in Mind. And so it seems correct to have 10 minutes to talk about 10 years. And I thought it was a fabulous thought experiment. Like, how do I do what I did in 800 pages in 10 minutes? So I thought what I would do was challenge the basic assumption of our meeting today and ask the question about psychoanalysis. One, how Viennese was it? And two, it would have been clunky in the title, how 1900 was it? So those are the two questions I want to ask today about psychoanalysis, and hopefully we'll come to some idea of a conclusion. You can move the slide. Okay, so the historiography of psychoanalysis traditionally was great man history, and there was a genius at the center of this. He wasn't really of a place or a time because he was a genius, and that was Sigmund Freud. And those models have been, of course, highly criticized. So in Revolution in Mind, I proposed a different model. I said, let's look at discursive communities, how they create ideas for each other, create boundaries that exclude certain ideas, and think about how permeable they are to others and how much interpretive variance they allow on the inside. And that allows us to think about Vienna as a very large, important player in this. But it still raises the question, how much is this individual? How much is this local culture, Vienna? And how much is this international culture? So those are the questions that we're going to try to sort out a little bit as we think about the emergence of psychoanalysis. Okay, next slide, please. So the model for how psychoanalysis arose that I put together is this. It involves Freud immersing himself in three different discursive communities, one very specifically French, the other at the top pretty specifically German, and the other really pan-European, and coming up with syntheses in each of these that were syntheses for the particular field that then led into an overarching synthesis that created a new field at the center, and that was Freudian theory. Next slide, please. All right, so let's go through this. The first model that became super important to Freud, the first discourse, was actually not Viennese at all, it was French. And it was La Psychologie Nouvelle, which was emerging in late 19th century France after Ribot started it in 1870. Charcot is a major player in this, where he started to move away from a reductionist model that had no place for mind and started to say, well, actually, there are these things like psychic dissociation that can cause unconscious ideas that do things. And so there's a little bit of psychogenesis in his model, and that's starting to really take off in France in the late 19th century. Next slide, please. We know that Freud went to Paris to study with Charcot, was very much taken by this model, somehow learned enough French to convince Charcot that he could be the French translator for Charcot from German. He didn't know French very well. Comes back to Vienna. He's going to be Charcot's man in Vienna. And almost immediately, Charcot is under attack. And actually, his authority is being deeply compromised by a couple of controversies with Bernheim and with the question about degeneration. Now, here's a critical moment where Freud is at the periphery, and that's important. In Paris, if you are in the midst of this world, medical world, it's very authoritarian. Either you're with Charcot or you're against him. And what you find Freud doing, and this is going to happen again and again, is he takes the freedom to be neither with nor against and to come up with a synthesis. So he comes up with a synthesis that rejects both strong positions and actually is very compelling. Next slide, please. And so in Studies in Hysteria, which he publishes with the Viennese mentor of his, Joseph Breuer, in 1895, it's very much a French book. It's a book of French psychopathology. Everyone reads it like that. It has French notions of trauma and models of intrapsychic dissociation and psychogenesis. And then there are two central innovations. Breuer is the one that we credit with the notion of the cathartic treatment, that when Anna O speaks, her symptoms disappear when she's in these dissociated states. And Freud comes up with this very novel idea about psychic defense, that the mind somehow is self-regulating. It defends itself against overstimulation. This is not to be found anywhere in the French literature. Now, the French don't really care. They say for the next 40 years, Freud ripped this off. This is French psychopathology. But in fact, that one edition of defense makes it not correct. That model of defense was not to be found in French discourse, and it made Freud turn to a very German discourse. Next slide, please. Now, here we have the question of whether 1900 was important, because this German discourse on the mind and its relationship to the brain, if Freud had emerged in 1830, would have been easy for him. There were lots of notions, romantic science, natural philosophy, where there was active processes in the mind. And so if it was the 1830s Freud, no problem. 1870 Freud, problem. Because this movement, the biophysics movement of 1847, had dominated science by saying, no more active forces. That gets very mystical and vitalist and all that. We study all of life, including mind, by reducing it to chemistry and physics. And these became the heroes of German and Viennese science. One of these is Ernst VICCA, who comes to Vienna and whose lab Freud is in. And so it's a problem to think about psychic defenses in that model. However, Freud didn't emerge in 1860 or 1870. He emerged around 1890 when that model was starting to fail. Why was it failing? Because reducing the mind to physics and chemistry made there no mind. And some people started to say, this doesn't really make sense. Dubois-Reymond, who was one of the great leaders of this movement, said, there are 7 world mysteries. Sounds better in German. You guys can say it. I'm not going to embarrass myself. But free will is one of them. Mind and speech is another one. So psychology is out the door. We can't explain it with this model. Freud still tries. He tries in what's called the Project for Scientific Psychology to use this reductionist model. He puts it in a drawer and says, this is madness. And he turns to something that in the 1890s with neo-romanticism is starting to come back into science, and that is, yes, Fechner and psychophysics. Psychophysics says, look, we don't know how to match quality and quantity, mind phenomena and energetics, but we're just going to think about the two as two ways of looking at the same thing. So they both are real. They both ultimately have to be part of the real biological world. but we don't know how to put them together. So Fechner would do these experiments with light, and you'd see, he'd put the candle 500 yards away, you couldn't see it, 450, you couldn't see it, 440, you see it. He's interested in what becomes unconscious and then conscious. Energy becomes quality, I see it, and so he says that's unconscious sleep process. The energy is getting in there where you can't see it. And then there's an energy intensity threshold, then you see it. That becomes conscious. That's his model, and Freud takes that model to then think about how to manage this notion of consciousness, unconsciousness, and psychic defenses. By the way, this is being used by Breuer and others to understand sensation. They don't want to eliminate sound as they want to think about sound and quantities. So he's got models for this, and this is now a very German addition to his theory. Right, in the interpretation of dreams, Freud's mind-brain approach comes not from biophysics, but from psychophysics, and that is very much about being around 1900 in this discourse. Unconscious and conscious domains are separated by an intensity threshold. That, in Freud's model, is defended. Okay, great. Next slide, please. So he's got stabilized this object of study. It's in the real world. It's not mystical. It's a mind-brain that is materialistic, and it allows for self-regulating active psychic defenses. But then the question that he leaves hanging, because if you read the interpretation of dreams from 1900, where he puts this model forth, he's all over the place on what's in the unconscious. There is no one thing in the unconscious. He's interpreting, if you read many, many different choices. So what's in the unconscious? And that's the question that made him turn to something that was a pan-European discourse with a very Viennese component. And that is the birth of sexual science. Now, sexual science starts in the 1860s, 1870s, and really starts to take off in the 1880s as sexology becomes a very legitimate scientific discourse. It is very much helped in Vienna when the most famous sexologist becomes the chairman of the psychiatry department, and that's Richard von Krafft-Ebing. He comes there in 1889. And again, here Freud goes for a synthesis. There's these two models, one of which is French about degeneration. The other is about, it's not just French, I should say it's French and pan-European, that people with sexual differences are degenerates. Then there's the model of association, where a stray association might make you have a fetish. And Freud enters this discourse and comes up with a synthesis. But this is a synthesis, actually, that doesn't just help him come up with a novel position in sexology. It unifies all the hanging positions that he had left from the other two discourses and allows him to pull together this very grand synthesis around this one simple word that's highly theorized: psychosexuality. Psychosexuality answers all the different questions from the different discourses. So in 1895, what are the traumatic ideas causing hysteria? They're sexual ideas due to libido. Roots the psyche in the body. What's the source of unconscious wishing? It's libido. What's the source of sexual difference? It's not degeneration or association, but it's a psychobiological developmental thing based on psychosexuality. Next slide, please. So it offers a link between reason.
A little bit,
I'm too slow. I'm too fast.
Oh, no, you're too fast.
Wir sind verschoben.
Go back.
Yeah.
You're up and go forward. And that's good.
Yeah.
So psychosexuality links reason and passion, mind and body, individual and species, the human and the animal, and offers the possibility of a new field. But you don't have a new field unless people come to you. How then, in the second chapter of this book, the second section of this book, do the Freudians emerge? And here we see even more so the influence of Vienna. Next slide, please. So Freud goes into these three different domains. He comes up with syntheses. If you hate one of those domains, you hate Freud. If you hate French psychopathology because after 1870, German nationalism says you should, you don't like this Frenchy Freud stuff. If you hate sexology because you think it's horrible and outrageous, you hate Freud. If you are French, you don't like Freud in part because he's ripped us off. But if you're interested in any of those three discourses, you're one of the many Austrian, German doctors are looking for something to do with patients. You want a psychotherapy of some sort. If you are a sexual reformer, you go, wow, this is exactly what we're talking about. All of these people start to come to Freud. And so I say, it's not so much that Freud created a revolution, so much as he took command of one that was already in progress. Next slide, please. So this is how it started to emerge. The Wednesday Psychological Society emerges in 1902, and you see people from the University of Vienna Medical School, and the F means they have some significant publication of French psychopathology. They too are interested in it. They come to Freud. They're doctors looking for treatments, that's something to do. Next slide, please. They don't have much cred in the general populace. Freud's books sell very, very little until 1905, when he writes the book on the theories of childhood sexuality. And then these people come to him. These people have power that's cultural. They suddenly make this guy a cultural figure. So you have people from the Viennese modernists who are sexual reformers. They're challenging notions of gender. They're challenging notions of sexuality. They're very much challenging Catholic notions of sexual morality. And they go, this is our guy. And he's doing science. And they come to Freud and they start writing about what this guy, Sigmund Freud, is doing. And suddenly his books, which are selling like nothing, become hotcakes. So these people have a very important role to play in Freud becoming at the center of a group called the Freudians. All right, next slide. So let's wrap up. How Viennese was the creation of psychoanalysis? Well, at the time, Freud's critics said his focus on sexuality was Viennese. They also said it was Jewish in Viennese. Freud and his followers resisted this insinuation. They wanted this to be a science of subjectivity that was universal. The accusation that this is Jewish, Viennese, distorted thinking made Freud really interested in moving the center of psychoanalysis to Protestant Zurich and Bleuler and Jung, and as we know, that had both a productive and then an explosive finale. Now, recent defenders of Freud, like Peter Gay, argued Freud wasn't so much Viennese. He was a European cosmopolitan whose scientific culture transcended being Viennese. And in part, we can see that some of that is true, but it misses a major point. Last slide, please. Vienna acted as a hub itself because of its extraordinary medical school and its extraordinary counterculture. But it was also, in another sense, on the periphery. It was open to French and German thought, but not as dependent on patronage and power in those centers. So Freud and his Viennese followers were engaged in a relatively open marketplace of ideas. Deploying these advantages, I argue, Freud was less a lone genius than a brilliant synthesizer, a ringmaster of many innovations from French and German sources. He took up these currents, came up with critical solutions, and pulled together coherent models that are in some ways quite Viennese, especially with the support of the moderns, but also sought to transcend that place. Last slide. In the attempt now to create an international movement, however, these specifically Viennese differences, and that centered around sexuality, became contested by other local cultures of psychoanalysis, especially in Zurich, and the movement, as it was just growing, nearly collapsed. But that, as they say, is another story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George, for this real tour de force. I have my thumb is red now. You mentioned discursive communities, people that had power to make Freud, you said, such a hot cake. I want to quote that. Katharina Prager, you are doing network research on networks, people that stick together, that form what Bourdieu has called the literary field or the artistic field. And we're like going back a little bit and look at the networks of the 1890s, so to say.
Yeah, I thought I'd present another genius and a bit of the workings of the hub that you were talking about. During the last days, Vienna celebrated the 150th birthday of the satirist Karl Kraus. And as the Vienna City Library holds Kraus papers, and as I have been involved in Kraus research for the past 13 years now, I was very, very busy. In fact, we Kraus scholars were quite stunned by the interest that Kraus aroused in these days. The Gartenbau Kino, one of the biggest cinemas in Vienna, was filled with up to 800 people. Looking at Kraus research and Vienna 1900, the situation is roughly this. Schorske's model, which remained so influential for a long time, more or less ignored him. However, scholars calling for new research paradigms around Vienna 1900 often explicitly referred to Kraus as opposition in the field, among them Stephen Bella, Johann Dvorak, Nike Wagner, Scott Spector, etc. And they often set dichotomies like aesthetic versus ethics, integration versus opposition, conservative modernism versus critical radical modernism, or center versus periphery, as you just mentioned. Out of Kraus research, which is quite a monoculture, came another model, probably familiar to you, but I still want to bring it to the table today, by the British Kraus scholar Edward Timms. To tackle not only Kraus's enormous body of work, but also the context, he started mapping, maybe you could go to the next slide, the Viennese cultural and political scene in overlapping Vienna circles, first on post-its that we hold in the Vienna Library, because we were lucky enough to get his papers. Yeah, he did it to get some orientation, and in his final, maybe you, yeah, right, perfect. That's the second graph.
I try to read your minds.
Yeah, okay. And in his final version, in the books published on Kraus, but also on the creative impulses of Viennese modernism, if we go to the next slide, it looks like this. And with the philosopher Jürgen Habermas, Timms argued that new circles and networks around progressive intellectuals in Vienna 1900 were the centers of innovation and structural change, and not the slow backward institutions at the time. For Timms, it was not only the famous Vienna circle around Moritz Schlick that most of you will know, but also different people like Freud, like Viktor Adler, like Rosa Mayreder, Adolf Loos, Eugenie Schwarzwald, for instance. Looking at this, please go back. Looking at this is on the one hand an extremely clear approach, on the other side it's an extremely simplified representation that cannot do justice to the complexity and dynamics of the circles, and they are very difficult to grasp only from letters, because they sometimes didn't have like memberships, official memberships, or manifestos or programs. And Timms himself already knew that he wouldn't gather the changeability and also the international connections that George Macari pointed out so well, and the tension between innovation and tradition that we were talking about. Nevertheless, this structure of circles is still stimulating, especially when trying to grasp it with digital methods, and I'll try to come back to that in the end. Timms also proposed a sketch of the Vienna circles of the 1920s and 30s, arguing that the end of the war and the proclamation of the First Republic led to a politicization of all the spheres of life. Many of these circles became cornerstones of Red Vienna. You see these are two momentary snapshots that focus on the scene after Vienna 1900, but not on the situation in the 1890s, when many of these circles were not yet existing. In the view of exiles, such as Hermann Broch and Berthold Viertel, which were largely ignored in post-war Austria, and I've been researching Berthold Viertel intensively and for a very long time, this formative period of the 1890s was important, however. Bertolt Viertel, who might not be known to you, was 11 years younger than Kraus, can be described as Kraus's spiritual son, was a faculty leader from the very beginning, and the two men had a special but not uncomplicated friendship which lasted until Kraus' death in 1936. In contrast to Karl Kraus, Bertolt Viertel had to flee into exile, where he began to analyze Vienna 1900 autobiographically. And this autobiographical project emerged around the same time as Stefan Zweig or Hermann Broch were writing their much better known texts on Vienna, and the three authors were also in touch with each other. Sorry. In Viertel's case, however, it was also a work, not only a work of exile, but also one of remigration, because Viertel returned to Austria in 1984 and attempted to bring Karl Kraus and a different view on modernity back to Austria, to the collective memory. His autobiographical project remained a fragment and wasn't widely noticed in research on Vienna 1900 so far. He did, however, look very closely, as I said, at the 1980s. When he was a young boy, he looked at the social mobility, which has been mentioned. He looked at Lueger. He writes a lot about Lueger. He talks about anti-Semitism, and he operates with pair of opposites around preservation and destruction. And these opposites are embodied for him in two generations, fathers and sons. I won't comment on that from a gender perspective today, but maybe we can do that in the discussion. It was essential for Viertel to trace the roots of the subsequent conflicts and catastrophes like the war, the Holocaust, and to consider the participation of everyone, driven by the question, how did it happen? And in doing so, Viertel structured the players of the cultural and political field, this is important too, as a family, which, as we know, unlike friends, cannot be chosen. And in his concepts, he contrasts the destroying sons with the preserving fathers, this is the next slide now. And generational affiliation here was not understood consecutively, and it was not related to actual age, but referred to the tension between those who wanted to make changes and those who were in favor of maintaining the status quo, so between progressive and reactionary actors, you could say. This meant that the young writer, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, for instance, was a father, even though he was so young, because he acted like a Weimar classic. And the much older poet, Peter Altenberg, was a son who wanted or allowed the dissolution of structures. And despite the revolutionary impetus of social democracy, Victor Adler was for Viertel clearly a system-preserving father and not a son of modernity. Adolf Hitler, on the other hand, was destruction itself. There are also dual or changing affiliations in the groups of fathers and sons, as you can see, and the remarkable thing about Viertel's construct is that the blending or changes of traditions are inscribed in it. Sons and fathers do sometimes have resemblances, they relate to each other, and as family, and sons often become fathers later. The other way around, however, is very rare. And this model might, for all of you who look at it, be very irritating, and we could go on and on discussing each name and why it's placed on this or that side. Sigmund Freud, for instance, is not mentioned here, but he is depicted as a destructive son in another fragment, and maybe you can show this on the next slide. I'm sorry I didn't translate it, but you will find all these are very important sons for Viennese modernism that are highlighted here. And those of you who speak German can maybe grasp what he did in that autobiographical project, and for the others, I'm happy to translate it later. Finally, I want to close with some remarks on the literary scene. Even though Kraus and Viertel were so engaged also with politics and not only the cultural scene, they were part of this cultural scene in a very privileged position. As dissidents, they belonged to that culture, or as Viertel put it, a working class child in Favoriten at the same time would have perceived the world differently. And a woman too, I might add, but Viertel and Kraus were not very aware of that. In the early 1980s, at the age of 17, Kraus first attempted to join the leading group of Viennese writers, Jung Wien, that already came up that came together into the Café Grünsteidl, and which Viertel later described as the Olymp. This is the last slide. He didn't want to name them Jung Wien. The young was not right for him. But before they turned to symbolism and to psychological topics, for a short time, naturalism, a trend from Germany, also had an impact in this scene. And during the 1980s, Kraus was part of the group but adhered to naturalism, which the others quickly overcame. And in these 5 years, he also began to take interest in satire. Together with a school friend, he planned a satirical anthology that he wanted to bring to Austria. It did not materialize, but the 5 years ended in 1896 with Karl Kraus' satirical demolition of the Viennese literary scene in the pamphlet Die demolierte Literatur. And thus a Viennese satirist was born, not yet working on the sexual question, not yet engaging with language, but financially independent enough to sustain this position for the next 40 years, attacking structural flaws in satirical types that were also historical persons. Satire, I want to add, there's been a very good podcast in the London Review of Books podcast on satire in the last month, which goes through history and satire. Satire is never systematic. It reacts to trivialities and to affairs of state. It has an ambivalent relationship to social change because it wants to address the discrepancy between ideal and reality, but not to improve the situation with solutions. There is much discussion how satire can be understood across time and place, and not least it is often the preserve of very educated men that can be surprisingly reactionary at times. Karl Kraus also had his attitudes and phases here. Satire is a phenomenon that often occurs in turbulent times at the turn of the century. It's a way into the period, it's also a way into its cultural history, but it's not an easy field for historians, and this might also be why so far Vienna 1900 research often didn't engage with Kraus or only on the side. However, since Kraus research has been conducted digitally since 2007, and various projects such as the Wien-Geschichte Wiki, but also the Personen der Moderne Basis at the ÖRW are now connecting these circles and generations in a much more precise way from working with editions that have been set up. And they can map the networks and the influences also over periods of time much more precisely. I wanted to point out these new foundations again, because I think there's also a lot, if you go to the last slide, there's the addresses where you can look it up, because I think that these depictions will also bring a lot of new insights in the next years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katja. I think you mesmerized us with the father and son slide, and we are still wondering who was the father of Otto Weininger. At least George will now bring us a bit closer to one of those important circles of the 1890s, and also the debates he had in the literary field, and maybe we also can then transcend to the medical field and bring that together until we reach the final on the culture of psychoanalysis. Please, Elise.
Thank you for the wonderful organization of these panels, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm actually not going to address the medical side of things because I think George's tour de force, as you called it, was such a wonderful summary. And I thought that I would focus much more closely on the relationship between psychoanalysis and literature, and take very seriously the panel's, part of the panel's title, which is how to rethink those relationships. So in some sense, it's a nice follow-up to Kathy's. I'll be taking a step back, but then also looking at the periphery of these networks that Edward Timms laid out. So the history of 20th century literature basically cannot be understood without the history of the reception of psychoanalysis. And there's basically hardly a significant author in the 20th century and beyond who did not in some way deal with psychoanalysis, specifically after the publication of Interpretation of Dreams in 1899. And psychoanalysis, conversely, also cannot be understood without its engagement with literature. But to speak of a model of direct mutual influence would be somewhat slightly misleading, especially in the earlier generation, especially in the pre-1900 period that we are talking about, or focusing on in this panel. It might be more fitting to argue that there was a kind of simultaneity of evolution of Freudian psychoanalytic theories and literary modernism alongside one another in Vienna, what Daniela Finzi so fittingly called Parallelaktionen, parallel actions, in the title of an exhibition, a great exhibition she curated at the Freud Museum in 2018. So I want to talk a little bit about these Parallelaktionen. When we speak of literature and psychoanalysis in the context of Viennese culture, it's probably most useful to frame both in terms of a kind of inward turn that began in earnest in the 1890s and which was also a pan-European phenomenon, although I don't think that we'll have too much time to get into that in the discussion. And I'd really just like to touch on 3 points today about the relationship between literature and psychoanalysis. And I come to this from my perspective as a literary scholar, first and foremost, but also as a cultural historian. The first point is the origins of the Young Vienna Literary Circle in the 1890s and the foregrounding of psychological states in the sort of invention of Young Vienna. The second point, which is Freud's own reflections on literary production, and I'll refer to a specific essay in that context. And third, and this is to me the project that's sort of closest to my heart, which is taking a critical look at the canon with regard to the interrelationship between literature and psychoanalysis. And that's a canon that we have to consider more expansively than just this prehistory of Vienna 1900 that this conference is foregrounding. So I'll take a bit of a longer perspective in the end. So first, the Young Vienna Literary Circle included, as we heard, such important writers as Arthur Schnitzler, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, Felix Salten, which you probably know from Bambi, Richard Beer Hoffmann, and many other lesser-known figures. Later members would be Karl Kraus, more loosely affiliated Peter Altenberg. Young Vienna has to be understood, though, as a conscious creation that appeared not least through a kind of targeted marketing strategy, which I think would be really interesting to think through with the reflections from the earlier panel too. A kind of targeted marketing strategy with a USP. What do I mean by that? In the model that Katerina presents of the fathers and sons, there's also a godfather in this picture. And that godfather, mentioned already last night in the opening panel, was Hermann Bahr. And he set out sort of single-handedly almost to kind of create this Mount Olympus of literary Vienna. He was a tireless networker, a literary critic who was very influential, mostly as a journalist. He did also write his own literary works, but they're largely forgotten. And he was a patron of many of these younger writers. Already in the early 1890s, Bahr's programmatic texts document a restless quest to define a specifically Austrian form of modernism that could rival those of Paris and Berlin. And so I just want to mention two essays that are important in this context. The first one is the groundbreaking essay Die Moderne, the Modern, from 1890, which details the characteristics of a new direction in Viennese art and literature. Truth, life, and consequently the purpose of modern art as such were to be found, according to Bahr, in the exploration of 3 domains. Those domains, according to him, were emotions, thoughts, and the body. So already in 1890, you see this kind of convergence of the inward turn with the attention to emotions and thoughts with a focus on the body, which is what my book actually talks about too. It's sort of uncovering the hidden side of Viennese modernism which through the focus on Freud and psychoanalysis in the historiography on Viennese modernism has sort of obscured the fact that the mind is an embodied mind. And I won't go into that here. I'll just leave you with that for now. The second essay by Bahr was revealingly titled The New Psychology, Die Neue Psychologie, and appeared 1 year later in 1891. And in this essay, he argued for new literary forms and a new method that represents a decisively inward turn, and attention to the impressions made by, quote, phenomena on the nerves and senses even before they have reached consciousness in the raw and unprocessed state, end quote. So by focusing on the interior, Bahr had given his concept of modern literature an anti-naturalistic foundation and thus created the conditions for countering the naturalism that characterized the Young Germany movement centered in Berlin. And he countered this with the Young Austria movement, or Young Vienna movement, which he headquartered in Vienna. So even if Jung Wien did not exist necessarily as a homogeneous group with a common literary program, its authors were largely perceived as such, and that's not least because of Bahr's commitment to literary politicking and to this shaping consciously of a literary field. Second, as Ruben Gallo mentioned in the panel earlier this morning, Freud's literary points of reference were hardly avant-garde. Goethe, Shakespeare were named. I'd also add to that Schiller, antique Greek drama, Sophocles, and all of these are well treated in the literature. But I just want to mention Freud's 1907 lecture, Creative Writers and Daydreaming, Der Dichter und das Fantasieren. I just kind of want to inject this into the discussion as an essay that Freud, in this sort of formative phase, where he took on two central questions about what is creative writing, basically. The first is a question about the parameters, conditions, and origins of literary creation. So he's asking kind of on what sources are writers in the literary field drawing on? What are the sources or materials on which fiction is based? The second question, by contrast, has to do with reception. So why does fiction have such a powerful and pleasurable effect on us as readers? So in this sense, Freud is interested in a kind of theory of the psychological reception of literature. And I won't go into much more detail just in the interest of time, but in this essay, Freud suggests that literary creativity is analogous to something that all of us can relate to, and that's child's play, in which children create fantasy worlds where elements of the real world are reconfigured in whatever possible way they like, and without making concessions to the reality principle. So literature has sort of a twofold therapeutic function. It's therapeutic for the writer on the one hand, but also for the reader on the other hand. We might ask ourselves, what creative writers is Freud thinking of here? And I will put that out there for discussion, because it's not necessarily the Shakespeares, the Goethes, the Schillers that he's thinking of in this essay. It's a much more mass market type of writer, which is an interesting contrast, I think. So finally, I want to just present to you an extremely brief overview of the Viennese literary canon by mentioning three names that have already come up in discussion. And when we think about literature and psychoanalysis, we cannot leave aside Arthur Schnitzler, who Freud had this kind of shy relationship with famously as his doppelganger, his literary doppelganger. The second figure would be Hugo von Hofmannsthal, who in some ways was, I think, an even more important reference for the framing of psychoanalysis in literary production. And the third is a lesser-known poet named Felix Dörrmann, who was part of this Young Vienna group, and his very early collection of poetry from 1891 called Neurotica, Sensationen. So there you have, in a nutshell, in the very title, already some of the concepts that were already important for scientific thinkers like Ernst Mach, but would also become very important for Freud as well, obviously. And I mention these three names really simply just to stake out the territory, because one could write an entire book on the interrelationship between literature and psychoanalysis, but there are already many such books. It's just that this literary canon that I mentioned here in very sketchy terms and the canonical historiography regarding Viennese modernism leaves out so very many names. In particular, I want to note that I don't think I've heard a single name of a female writer come up in this discussion yet so far. And aside from Richard Cockett's mentions of Marie Neurath, Lise Meitner, and other famous figures from sociology and from scientific disciplines, we really haven't come up with a single literatin who's been mentioned here. And really, in order to truly chip away at this persistent Vienna 1900 mythology, we have to work on reframing the canon to be more inclusive, excuse me, and expansive. And in order to do that, with regard to literature and psychoanalysis specifically, we have to look a little bit beyond this 1890s decade into the early decades of the 20th century and into the 1920s. So I'll just give you 3 thumbnail sketches as a way of staking out perhaps differently inflected literary canon that still, in very clear terms and very profoundly, takes on psychoanalysis in literary production in Vienna at this specific time. The first name is Grete Meisel-Hess, and I'm going to just tell you a little bit about each of these figures because none of them are very well known at all. Meisel-Hess was born in Prague in 1879, raised in Vienna. She's known mostly as a politically active feminist reformer, particularly in the domain of women's sexuality, but she was well versed in new trends in psychology and psychoanalysis. She wrote a really interesting withering counter pamphlet in 1904 to Otto Beininger's infamous Geschlecht und Charakter, which she titled The Hatred of Women and the Contempt of Women, Weiberhass und Weiberverachtung, and really it's a withering takedown. But she also penned the kind of inwardly oriented fiction her male counterparts were known for. And I'll mention just the novella Suchende Seelen, Searching Souls, from 1903. And in 1912, she published a novella called The Other Life, Das andere Leben, which she a little bit later called her own Traumnovelle, her dream story. And that was already more than a decade before Schnitzler's own very canonical Traumnovelle. She also wrote nonfiction, including a book called The Sexual Crisis, a socio-psychological investigation in 1909, which does nothing less than try to insert a female counter-perspective into Freud's and Breuer's deeply gendered constructs of hysteria and neurosis. Like Arthur Schnitzler, the second figure I want to mention is Marie Fischoff-Pappenheim, who was born in 1882 in Bratislava. She was both a doctor and a writer. They had very interesting sort of parallel careers, she and Schnitzler, but whereas Schnitzler turned largely away from medicine increasingly to focus more on his writing, Marie Pappenheim made exactly the opposite decision. Her work was amplified by Karl Kraus, who published poems by her in 1906, very early on in VICCA, while she was still a medical student. So she was among the first generation of women to complete medical training in Vienna. The medical school, I believe, only admitted women from 1900 on. And she was commissioned in a connection brokered by Kraus and the composer Alexander Zemlinsky to write a libretto for Schönberg in 1909. What resulted from that was the monodrama Erwartung, expectation. And this would be, of course, Schönberg's first stage-length performance. And Pappenheim is largely forgotten as the author of this libretto. And even in the interpretations of the libretto, there's a very misleading, I think, interpretation of the piece as a kind of Freudian psychoanalytic case study, as the unnamed woman, as a hysterical protagonist. And the drama actually reveals quite a lot more, and that includes that the story is from a woman's perspective. We have a female protagonist, and it inverts the classic love triangle model. And finally, the last author I want to mention is Mela Hartwig. She was a writer, actress, and visual artist. As an actress, she actually played Elektra in a staging of Hofmannsthal's drama in the Austrian provinces. And I just want to mention her late expressionist collection of novellas called Ekstasen from 1928. So I've jumped forward here about 2 decades. But these texts are extremely important. The novella Das Verbrechen, which is sort of the central one, depicts various symptoms of psychic illness, but it's also the depiction of a relationship between a quote-unquote hysterical daughter and her psychologist father. And it makes significant correctives, I think, to Freud's images of female psychosis, not only from the position of the poet, but also from that of a woman. In fact, it presents psychoanalysis as one of the key ways in which interrelational power is exercised and exploited. So I just send out those 3 names as food for future thought and research. Thanks.
Daniela, sind Sie, as a clock is ticking and the Bösenbraucher is hanging especially above my head, and I want to keep it, the Bösenbraucher as well as the head, as an attempt to synthesize what we've heard. I remember we were sitting on a panel recently, and we quoted, somebody quoted a biographer of Freud saying psychoanalysis was the discourse of men about women, and you challenged that. So we're interested to hear your approach to synthesize all those very deep thoughts that we heard
I
so
will
far.
start with my very short lecture, and first of all I would like to say thank you for Oliver Radkolb to bring us together again to rethink about Vienna 1900, and also to Director Susanne Kepler-Schlesinger to host us. I'm very happy to be on this panel, and I'm very honored to share a panel with you, dear George, because I have to say that your books have been so crucial for us when we were reorganizing the new permanent exhibition of the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna. So I'm honored, but I'm a little bit nervous too, and it's like a mission impossible to speak after you. So, so this said, I just would like to start with one quote by Bruno Bettelheim, which I find really instructive and inspiring. And then I brought some very short points, topics or slogans which I would like to share with you. So Bettelheim, and this was a text he wrote for the catalogue of the exhibition, the Paris exhibition, Vienne l'Apocalypse Joyeuse in 1986, he says, and you have already mentioned the moment of simultaneity. So I quote, things have never been better, but at the same time they have never been worse. This strange simultaneity, in my opinion, explains why psychoanalysis, based on the understanding of ambivalence, hysteria and neurosis, originated in Vienna and probably could have originated nowhere else. So this was just the beginning. I would like to start now with my very minimalistic PowerPoint and address a few words to say what I think which proved new and innovative when Freud began to develop in the 1880s what later became known as psychoanalysis. And I think psychoanalysis, this is a quote by Eli Saretsky, once said that psychoanalysis was the most successful export article from Vienna to the United States. Yeah. But this new term of psychoanalysis, this is interesting too, was first used by Freud in 1896, and interesting enough, it was used in French for his essay L'hérédité et l'étiologie des névroses. And this brings me to my first point, which is called here words. So I'm talking about language and the importance of language. Language is constitutive for any psychoanalytic experience. And I think before Freud, we did not realize how much language already speaks in plain language. So the question of what happens to me when I speak and what is concealed in the process, this question was not asked in this way before Freud. As early in the 1890s, when he was working with his hysteria patients, writing this Urbuch of Psychoanalysis, Studies on Hysteria, with Breuer, and developing Breuer's cathartic method, Freud recognized that, to put it briefly, that memory liberates and that narrative or narration heals. Also, what I find interesting is the notion of unknown knowledge, which Freud deals with. So the patient who comes to the psychoanalyst has a knowledge, but does not know he or she is already knowing. So in other words, the unconscious are those things that we don't know that we know. The talking cure, as we can also call the psychoanalytic treatment, and this is a term which was not coined by Freud, but by Freud's patient, Anna O. Bertha Pappenheim. So the talking cure aims at a progressive revelation of this knowledge to the patient and is based on the premise that the only means of access to this knowledge is via language, is via free association. Next slide, please. So sometimes there is just a title, nothing else. In his work with hysteria patients in the early beginning of the 1890s, Freud began to understand and conceive the hysterical symptom as the expression of a conflict between a desire which cannot be accepted and its defense. So I think this is what is so special about Freud's conception of the human being, which he is locating in the field of tension between desire and prohibition, between pleasure and unpleasure, between fantasy and reality, between inner and outer world. This also means a clear rejection of the rational self of liberal culture, a rational self who would control his feelings and passions. So Freud points out something that still makes him so relevant and contemporary today. It's the contradictory nature of the human being, his off-centeredness, his incompleteness. Next slide, please. Reversal, or I should better say inversion of power and normality. I think this moment of Umkehrung, inversion or reversal, is interesting in two respects. So already in the case studies of the studies on hysteria, a reversal of the doctor-patient relationships becomes apparent. Now it is the patient, and mostly the female patient, who speak, and it's the doctor, the male expert, who listens. So I would say that Freud's discovery and development of the psychoanalytic method in the 1890s is characterized by the progressive abandonment of techniques of manipulation, control, and domination. Conventional configurations of power are dissolved here. Just think of Charcot and his demonstration of female hysterics, where the controllability of the irrational, also connoted as feminine, was exhibited. But Freud also reversed or redefined the traditional relationship between normality and pathology. Already in the first edition of the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, published in 1905, provides an eloquent example on this. It contains a radical deconstruction of the normative distinction between pathology and normality. Freud does not regard the pathological as the opposite of the normal, but on the contrary as an intensification or fixation of a certain developmental phase of the normal. Thank you. Now I lost my page. Yeah, next slide, please. So exchange and circles. We know Freud needed a sounding board, and he was looking for exchange and discussion in formal and informal circles. And I think the importance of this exchange with others cannot be overestimated in a time which was so much marked by profound social changes and conflicts. For Freud, we heard already about it, this was the so-called Psychological Wednesday Society, which met from 1902 at Berggasse 19 over black coffee and cigars, and which became the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in 1908. But before, already in the late 1890s, Freud became an active member of the Jewish service organization Neibrit, which offered Freud the opportunity for social contact and intellectual exchange. However, it is important here also to know that Freud kept a certain distance to special circles, to special colleagues, and we heard about Arthur Schnitzler already, to colleagues who might have been too close for him. So Schnitzler is a very good example, and I think this is something we really need to keep in mind, that these circles were existing in the same city, but not working. This idea of transdisciplinarity is a nachträgliche construction, as Freud would call it. Yeah. Next slide, please. Taking up, thinking further, dropping. It's simply not possible to trace now the various influences and sources, and we have heard a lot about it already, that shaped and moved Freud. There are so many and too many of them, and they go back a long way. Be it Bible readings or the humanistic education at the gymnasium, or the various currents that shaped Freud's studies at Vienna University: evolutionism, biophysicalism, English empiricism, and anthropological materialism. You just spoke, George, about Freud as a brilliant synthesizer, and I think this is really a good point. Jacques Derrida also draws our attention to the moment of dissidence against the Roman Catholic character of Vienna in order to understand the special significance of Greek antiquity, be it for Freud or for the intellectuals of the first generations of Viennese modernism. Homer, Sophocles, and Plato enabled an orientation towards a non-Habsburg educational ideal. For our questions of what lessons we can learn from Freud's development of psychoanalysis, I think we could note a certain fearlessness in dropping any theory at the moment when his own clinical experience contradicts it. And in addition to this fearlessness, the multilingualism in Freud's aim to grasp and to record is also remarkable. And in doing so, and this is here the quote, in doing so, he avoids a central perspective, but on the contrary, adopts a multi-perspectivity. And what also characterizes his position or attitude could be described as Entzauberung, as disenchantment. And Freud is not afraid to take these detours, which brings me to the next point. Slide, please. Psychoanalytic thinking, in cases, in Zauberrhythmus, in myths. Psychoanalysis is committed to induction. Its thinking can be described as John Forrester as a thinking in cases. But this description alone does not go far enough. Freud's thinking, or psychoanalytic thinking in general, also exhibits a very specific movement that one could call, using a Freudian expression, a Zauberrhythmus, vacillating rhythm. By this I mean that movement of slowly opening up a problem, that reflexive and in a certain sense deconstructive approach to a question that constantly gives birth to new, different questions and produces a multiplication of perspectives and meanings. Freud's thinking is also, in Elisabeth Rudinesco's work, a thinking in myths. Freud's stroke of genius consisted in tracing the great constants of the human mind back to Greek myth and its tragedy. Freud's strength lies in having taken individual destinies out of a purely medical perspective, tracing them back to invariable of humanity. And this brings me to the last point, the Unzeitgemäßheit, the untimeliness of psychoanalysis, erzählen, nicht sehen, recounting, not counting. Freud has, in the words of Friedrich Hebel, disturbed the sleep of the world. He has brought a kind of Denkschmerz and still does. Today, in our globalized age, which requires flexible and disposable people, psychoanalysis is at odds with the times, with the zeitgeist, when it insists on individuality, when it clings to inalienable experiences, when it insists on the central importance of attachment and relationship. Erzählen, nicht sehen, this is the credo of psychoanalysis, which we should not ignore, just as psychoanalysis should not neglect to seek dialogue with other science, to face up to contemporary challenges, to allow itself to be questioned by them, so as not to indulge in an isolated position. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you to the whole panel. We are Bösendorfer -1. So Oliver proposed I should make a synthesis. I will open the panel for discussion after the Bösendorfer went down, and maybe we continue in the lobby. It's difficult, especially after after 4 presentations and 3 panels we had today. But let me propose you some sort of synthesis to Vienna pre and post 1900. I think, and especially your speeches showed it, I think we should rethink singularity of Vienna 1900. I think we should be open to name and rename the international networking and the way Vienna sort of amalgamized a strand of modern thinking with the specialities of this town. I think for us as Austrians, I think it's important to rethink the roots. I found it very valuable to what Anita said, to bring a new perspective on historicism. I think it's not just a copying of past ideal form. I think it's more, it's also anti-mimetic. And I think, of course, as you all said, let's rethink the canon of people presented, works reflected, and open the field up to a gender perspective, multicultural perspective. I mean, we're still talking in Vienna about German-speaking modernity, and I mean, it's what do we know from Hermann Bahr, not his literary works, but his positioning. And I think as we are pondering what Vienna tells us about the presence we're living in, I think rethinking the canon means rethinking representation in a society. As we heard Veronica Karl Kraus, we try to open up culture to the multi-ethnic perspectives Vienna has, but what about the media? What about us with the ORF? What about people who have their say in the public domain? And I think we as Austrians can learn a lot about them from Americans again, because you were finding your positioning with your research in a much more complex, open society that consists of many different sources. And having thought about networks, I think I invite all of you to continue networking now. I found it very attractive, and meeting you all in the audience. I thank you very much for your attention. It was a short conference, but it was like in Austria say Hindersaft. You have 1% of syrup, and then you add like 90% of water, and so I think this is continuing in our heads, in our discussions. And I want to thank Susanne Kepler-Schlesinger, and I want to thank all those people working here for this perfect conference, because I know that it's many, many hands and many attentions for the sound. Thank you very much. It is a great honor and pleasure to be sitting here in this extraordinary building. I've heard we should mention the city of Lienz every day, so it's I get my bonus points here. And I think it's great that I think this building reflects Austria. It's small, but it's extraordinary, and I think we should learn to be proud also in the complexity of our smallness. Thank you very much.